quand je pense au génie mahlérien, à tout ce que contiennent les symphonies que nous connaissons, à l'inimaginable complexité, à la profondeur de cet art, qui vraiment n'a pas beaucoup d'égal, à mon avis, dans la musique et dans aucun art, c'est une musique qui ne ressemble absolument à aucune autre.
This is a man, what every tone of every harmony made something. I personally believe he looked at anything. He looked at a rock, he looked at a leaf, he looked at a tree, he looked at a face, he looked at an eye. Whatever he looked at, whatever he took as reality, he heard. And this is for me the music.
Ma ci sono sempre, come sempre in tutte le sinfonie di Mahler, questi grandi contrasti di gioia, di felicità, di amore, e poi questi colpi terribili di sofferenza, di grande sofferenza.
Mahler est autrichien et juif. Il est né à Kalisté, près d'Iglau, entre la Bohême et la Moravie. Dans cette région, en Pays tchèque, les Juifs sont de fervents défenseurs de la culture allemande. Cette origine lui fera dire plus tard
« Je suis 3 fois sans patrie. Un bohémien parmi les Autrichiens, un Autrichien parmi les Allemands et un Juif pour tous les peuples du monde. »
Mahler dealt with anti-Semitism throughout his entire life. In 1907, he was forced to resign from his post as director of the Vienna Court Opera. That same year, Mahler's eldest daughter, Maria, died from scarlet fever. Feeling lost and hopeless, he soon found out that he was diagnosed with a heart defect. Pouring himself into his music, Mahler was desperate to find his identity, but he was well aware of death approaching. In 1908, he read a translation of ancient Chinese poetry and found what he had been looking for. This translation, called The Chinese Flute, was written by Hans Bethge, a poet at the time who adored Chinese poetry. He studied modern languages and philosophy, but his real passion was writing. On top of translating thousands upon thousands of ancient Chinese poems, he also published several volumes of poems, mainly on love and nature, diaries, travel logs, short stories, essays, and plays. His first book, The Chinese Flute, had a printing of 100,000 copies. Mahler used 7 of its poems in Das Lied von der Erde. The success of the piece was so great that many composers decided to take the poetry and make their own adaptations.
We must be swift as a coursing river.
In order to understand Hans Bethge's love of Chinese poetry, we need to actually go back to the Tang Dynasty when the poet Li Bai was alive.
The Tang Dynasty is considered the golden age of Chinese civilization. This holds true for the field of poetry. One of the key figures in this golden age of poetry was Li Bai. Li was known for his romantic style of writing, and has come to be called the immortal poet. Li lived from 701 to 762 AD, spending much of his time traveling around China. He served briefly as a poet at the Hanlin Academy in the capital city of Chang'an, at the request of Emperor Xuanzong. Li did have one habit that some viewed as a defect. He drank, and drank a lot.
Since we are focusing on the first movement of Das Lied von der Erde today, I decided to look at the poem itself. The original poem is called Bei Ji Xing, a pathetic song, and mixes drunken happiness with a deep sadness. The line in the poem, "The song of sorrow shall ring laughingly in your soul," gives a description that makes you think the narrator of the poem is laughing at his own misery. He is so downtrodden that there is nothing for him left to do but laugh. The line, "Dark is life, dark is death," is repeated several times in this poem. It is almost as if the narrator has come down from his drunken ecstasy long enough to mourn his own sorrows, as well as the pain he has experienced from death. So why does this translation matter to Mahler? With the increase of trade between Europe and the Far East in the 1900s, exoticism began to spread. Not only did this affect Hans's interest in Chinese literature, but it also brought new ideas to Mahler.
Mahler's symphony called
Trinklied vom Jammer der Erde,
also known as the Drinking Song of the Earth's Misery, was premiered on November 20th, 1911. What makes this piece interesting was because Mahler used extreme maximalizing in his orchestration. Not only was his orchestra outrageously large, Mahler was boss at deciding what notes should go where and how to maximize those concepts. For example, when the piece begins, he already has the brass instruments reaching extremely high and almost straining notes, and the bass instruments reaching very low notes. Mahler had included voice and orchestra for his second, third, and fourth and eighth movements. However, the Drinking Song of the Earth's Misery was the first work which integrated song cycle and symphony, thus forming the term song symphony to describe most of Mahler's work throughout his life. To demonstrate how big Mahler's orchestra was, the instruments involved were piccolo, 3 flutes, 3 oboes, 3 clarinets, 4 French horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, bass, tuba, percussion, timpani, celeste, 2 harps, mandolin, and strings, as well as an alto and tenor soloist. Surprisingly, only the first, fourth, and sixth movements are when the entire orchestra plays at once. The first movement uses a large chamber group as previously stated, having many long passages used as material to support the singer. The first movement illustrates energy and terror in the face of life. It also illustrates life's miseries that come from being on earth. However, the drunken man from the poem was contemplating how dark life and death are while falling in and out of consciousness. The piece itself is very melodic. The bass instruments run a lot of 30-second notes and 64-note scalar runs throughout the first movement, and sometimes reaching up to 4-letter lines or into the alto part. I also noticed that he changes keys very progressively, such as within the first 3 to 4 minutes, Mahler decided to change keys with about 3 times within a 2-minute gap, and modulates to create a denser texture or sorrow, as well as the dynamics of the instruments go from fortissimo to pianissimo within 5 measures of each other, having huge dynamic marks within certain parts of the piece stand out, for example, like in the beginning. Mahler was boss at maximalizing the orchestra by first having a large orchestra, strained notes, progressive and fast scalar runs, and insane dynamic and key changes, and having a very dense texture makes this symphony very recognizable and a memorable piece. It breaks the boundaries of what maximalizing really is, and to Mahler, it's taking everything to the impossible extremes. This piece was conceived during a summer spent in the village of Tobec, where the beautiful woodlands and majestic mountains must have had been a source of inspiration for the rich exoticism which pervades the music and philosophy of this piece. The details found in the music had a certain purpose as shown. The idyllic scenes found are also in the poetry. The birds in the opening movement are mimicked by ornamental flourishes, trills, and tremolo, played by the flute. The bird sound successions, followed by a long sustained note, are reminiscent of rhythmic and melodic motifs found in traditional Chinese folk song. Mahler has been described by critics as excellent for his assembly of different musical styles, his imaginative display of orchestral colors in this piece, such as the brass percussion in the opening movement, Mahler's concoctions of varying timbres not only invoke sounds associated with the Asian culture, but create an exciting new sound world. In contemporary Western culture, the exotic has the potential to transport the listener to an unknown, even fascinating land. It is through this exoticism that the audience is exposed to the culture and philosophy of an uncharted land, so that it too, led by the narrator's hand, may disappear into a colorful canvas of Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde. I got it all but the title.
It was great.
I got it all but the title.
I'm just gonna keep this part last part in.